So very happy to be here despite the soggy Spring Valley nature here. I remember this from many years ago when I was a farmhand up at before there was a fellowship actually. There was this open fields with lots of bugs. That was my job, to try and peel off bugs from underneath bean plants. That was my summer job at the age of 16. I remember 16 because when I turned 16 and one day old, that's the day I got my driving license. And just as an introduction to tonight, today, 30% of teenagers don't get their driving license when they turn the age when they're eligible. And you might ask the question, what has changed in only a generation of teenagers that you'd go from 16 in one day, me, to 20s and maybe later in the age of Uber and Lyft and other reasons why they don't have licenses. But I think there's something else underneath that that might be worth a talk some other night, not tonight. Before we start, it might be helpful just to get a sense of you as you have a sense now of me. Let's see, would you raise your hand if you are a parent in the preschool up through kindergarten? Preschool, there you are. And if you're a parent from first grade through fourth grade, you can vote more than once. Fifth grade through eighth grade. Great, excellent. High school parent. Okay, you work in a Waldorf school somewhere. You are a volunteer in a Waldorf school somewhere. All the hands should go up with that one. Let's see, you are the parent of a graduate of a Waldorf school. Aha, the veterans, excellent, yeah. You're here the first time tonight, possibly? Welcome, very welcome. You haven't voted yet. What's the category I missed?
I'm not a parent of a kid here at another school.
Oh, you're a parent, okay, you're just a parent.
No, of children, but not at Waldorf.
Aha, good category, glad you're here. Anybody else I missed as a category?
Grandparents.
Of course, grandparents, yes. All right, and cameraman. So welcome to you all. Now this evening, as you know, I have a rather unusual title called Three Tsunamis of Soul, but then there's a subtitle. And the subtitle is Teens Won't Drown If They Reach for Higher Ground. And by the end of this evening, I'm hoping at least we will just adumbrate, briefly touch on this theme of the higher ground as well as the ground they work and live on as teenagers. But as a beginning, I thought it might be helpful just to get a sense of where we are these days on this issue, because you as parents, either of lower school or high school or graduate students, this school, somewhere else, you're obviously in touch with the children of today, the students of today, and that's what we're talking about this evening. So, I'd be interested in knowing from you what you would say in answer to the following question. Before I do that, there are chairs here if you'd like to be closer to me as opposed to the exit. If you want to flee, that's different, but if you want to be with us, it's more comfortable down here. All right, so now the question. And the question is, if you were to think of the typical most common pathologies or most common ailments or most common problems that teenagers would complain of today, what would you single out as the most likely conditions that they would speak to and maybe you would speak to on their behalf? What would you say? Loneliness. Now let me capture some of this on the board here. So loneliness. Okay. What else? Stress. What else? Uncertainty. What else? Yes. Boredom. That's a nice one. By the way, boredom is a very positive quality. We might come to that. Pressure. Can I change that slightly?
Did you call it something else?
I call it stress.
Stress.
Yeah, but pressure is obviously behind this notion of stress.
What about moody?
Which?
Moody.
They may not complain about that. They may just be that. We're talking about the pathologies that they say are most problematic in their age group.
I don't know how to put this in one word, but I feel like they ask for more attention from their parents, but I feel they don't get any
Yeah.
attention.
So it has something to do with tension or lack of attention. That's very important. We'll come to that. Yes?
A feeling that everyone is against them, persecution.
Persecution, yeah. Often the spin-off from loneliness.
Similar along those lines was feeling misunderstood.
Misunderstood, right. Another hand. Where were you? Yes.
That was mine.
Oh, you're clairvoyant. Yes.
What might be called FOMO, or fear of missing out.
Yes. You know about this one? FOMO, fear of missing out. This has a lot to do with technology. There's something related to that called now nomophobia. Nomophobia. No mobile telephone phobia. Yes.
About, I think that parents embarrass them.
Yes. Yes. Mercifully, that one passes, but some of these others linger much longer.
Overscheduled or not having enough free time.
Ah. I'll abbreviate, overscheduled. A hand back there, where were you? There are a couple of obvious ones. Maybe they're too obvious, but they're worth mentioning. Most pervasive, often clinical statement, and even diagnosis. Depression. And interesting enough, you're the first group I've interviewed in this way that has not mentioned the one that usually comes up first.
Anxiety.
Exactly. Was that just too obvious to mention? At least statistically, we'll come to that in a minute, that ranks as number one. So we have already here 1, 2, 3. Those are the 3 tsunamis. You have accurately identified them with one prompt. And that is what we'll talk a bit about this evening. But actually, I concealed in my title the fact that it's not 3, but 6 tsunamis. I was concerned if I put 6 in the title, you wouldn't come. But nonetheless, you have pointed already to the 4th one, which is this one. And I hope to come back to that this evening. But there are 2 others that are perhaps a bit more obscure in the language, although they are implicit in what you have mentioned in this group of conditions as well. And if that's number 4, then number 5, I will offer to you as something that teenagers may have and then react against what they have with what looks like the opposite but isn't.
Low self-esteem. Low self-esteem.
Yes, that's another example of that. This has a variation to do with uncertainty. But one way of masking this low sense of self-esteem is to come across as being extremely certain and extremely steamed. And it could be called arrogance, but that one of the risks of being judgmental. But I will offer a slightly different word for that, but I will use it in the original meaning of its word, and that is fanaticism. In other words, in this age of uncertainty, in this age of, as you say, lower self-esteem and so forth, all that mud and soup, they present themselves with the face of conviction and certainty. Or put it differently, they grab onto one thing and hang on to that, whatever that is, could be a cause, could be a reason, could be a prejudice, no matter what. And that also, I think, is worth a bit of conversation tonight. And then there's one last one, a kind of grab bag that pulls a lot of these into them, and that is the sense, as you have hinted at here, this uncertainty business, this kind of fiery feeling of being persecuted, misunderstood, and all these elements here. Put all that together into a kind of a grab bag term, and often what the teenagers will report is a sense that the world is in fragments, that nothing is connected, and that they don't know what to do with that unless they become possibly fanatic, but they don't know what to do with these fragments, and certainly society doesn't help very much in sorting it out or making it look more coherent. And the fact that it doesn't look coherent is, I think, of immense significance for them, for us, and for the theme of anxiety and general fear. So I'm going to throw this one in here as fragmentation. Recognizing that you've come at it by the back door in many cases. These I would offer as kind of 6 conditions that the teenager is working with very strongly, especially then these first 3. Now my next question to you would be, if you look at those 3 for the moment, we'll take these 3 for separate for a moment, then we'll come to the other 3. Can you see them, by the way, over here? Then if you look at the 3 on the left here, are there any themes or shared aspects that come to mind that would connect in some way these three pathologies or these three tsunamis thematically? Do they share anything, do you think? Yeah.
From my experience, they tend to flow into each other.
Uh-huh.
So too much stress pushes you into anxiety, and too much anxiety pushes you into depression.
Right. And can you say any bit about the qualities that they might share?
That insecurity.
Certainly they share, can you see that? They share the sense of not being sure. That's where the fragmentation and fanaticism is almost the flip side of that. But yes, the sense of uncertainty.
Fear?
Yes, that's a kind of global kind of umbrella term for these three and possibly even those others as well. But certainly the three on the left. Yeah. Yes.
Picking up like an expectation from outside of themselves, maybe that they can't, that there's something that they're supposed to be or do or say or embody that's not, doesn't feel natural, doesn't feel like who they are, and so they're stuck in this space of, do I go there or do I stay here, and I'll just be stuck in there.
Yes. And notice at least with this one, to some degree that one, maybe even a little bit this one here, but certainly these, the first and the third, notice the focus is on the world. In that sense, expectations, what they expect, what it needs, what them wants. Depression possibly can become a bit more self-absorbed, but even that, often depression, at least beginnings, has to do with the world is too much, or too many burdens, or the outside world, which is you folks, by the way, parents. You, the parents, or the school, or life, or money is asking too much, or placing too much burden on me. And then one can become self-absorbed after that. So those are common elements that you can see. Yes?
So another common element is shame.
Say a bit more about that.
One of the professor once said that the root of all anxiety is shame. And with these conditions, then students feel that somehow they're responsible for these feelings, and they feel shame inwardly.
Yes. That's very interesting you say that. And now we begin to have empirical evidence to demonstrate that. How many of you have seen the film, came out just a few months ago now, it's not on the circuit, it's being privately shown. The film is called Angst. Angst in American. Angst. Only a couple of you?
It's not quite out yet. It's only released for education.
That's right, so it's not on the public circuit yet. And it may not even be so, it may circulate among schools. But a fair number of Waldorf schools have now shown it. And it's somewhat simple, but it's very graphic and describes then what you're pointing to, this feeling that the kids have that it's my fault that this is happening to me. It's not the world that's to blame. I'm somehow burdened with this, especially in the case of depression.
I think so much is happening also internally, like all the hormones are growing and raging, there's so much change going through the body that often lend itself to even internal stress, if not the anxiety of the changing body.
Yes, and don't overlook the fact of the growth spurt, a huge physiological change which will drain anybody. Yes?
I want to say two things, that these things are appearing much lower in age now, so with other causes than hormones and things like that.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that one thing that these all produce as a effect that we see is a lower functioning. They can all affect their ability to learn, right?
Yes.
And their ability to their social ability, right?
Yes.
If you have anxiety, if you're depressed, all of these things. So these are the things that we see in class that can lead us to questioning, is there anxiety, is there depression, what's happening with this child? You know, they're all of a sudden, what they were able to do, they're not able to do anymore.
Yeah. So to pick up on the two things you said, first the earlier onset. Now clinically we begin to recognize that the average onset of anxiety is now age 7.
Yeah.
That's the beginning. And with regard to the second thing you said, which is very interesting, this low functioning or lower functioning, unable to quite do it, this has a lot to do with what I want to come to this evening, namely what happens when you're in this condition, especially this one and this one. In terms of the physiology, if you're in a state of anxiety, also of stress, to a lesser degree of depression, then physiologically you'll notice what happens to you is this. That is to say, you close up. You even use that language, or close down. Now what does that mean? Physiologically, it means, first of all, that certain reflexes are working one-sidedly. You see, we all have this reflex. You can all do it, right? Mm-hmm. And once you've done this, you'll do this. And this gesture, that is the clenching, the closing, this is under, unfortunate language, is under the direction of what are called the sympathetic nervous system, having nothing to do with sympathy, by the way. The sympathetic nervous system. But in order to be a healthy human being, you have to have, to one reflex, the counter reflex in equal measure. And what is the countermeasure? How do you get to do this? How do you get to open the fist in this case? Well, if this is a sympathetic reaction, then this is called a parasympathetic reaction, only because the nerves that govern this opening gesture are here and here, above and below, around the sympathetic nerves that are in the middle. So when we look at children and we see them coming in this condition as opposed to this condition, we can say two things. One, if they are in this condition, that is to say in the sympathetic mode, they are good at fighting or running away, and adrenaline will help with that, but they are not going to be able to learn anything. You cannot learn in this condition. The only way you can learn is in this condition. So now we have, as you may know, on the West Coast, this medical doctor, Susan Johnson, a name perhaps known to you. She has a wonderful website, by the way, if you want to check out this in more detail. She's gathered a lot of material on this subject. So Susan Johnson out there, working as a pediatrician with very young children, is describing now how in her practice she sees children much younger than 7 now, we're talking 2, 3, 4, 5, coming into her practice in this lock. They are locked into the sympathetic reflex, which does all kinds of things to the heart. It's not just the striated muscles that get cramped. Although if you do this long enough, you will have all kinds of cramps, including stomachache. So now she has to work as a medical doctor now with massage and other kinds of techniques and even some medicaments to induce this other parasympathetic reflex so that the children can go to school. So it's quite serious what you're mentioning there in terms of this gesture actually lowering, shall we say, the capacity to learn. Now, just a couple of statistics before we get to work. This is obviously more or less dependent on your education. That does have a big impact. But if you take the national norm, then there's been some statistics coming out of the National Institute for Mental Health, and they report now that a third, 32%, almost a third of adolescents are diagnosed as having some kind of nervous or anxiety disorder. It's not that they're anxious, that's higher. They are diagnosed with a disorder, meaning they are eligible for some kind of treatment or therapy. That's almost a third of teenagers. And although, again, the numbers, roughly 12% are diagnosed clinically now, diagnosed with a state of depression, which is a very large number compared to what it was even 15 years ago. That's one number. Specific then to the older adolescents in university, there was another study done by the American College of Health Association, and they, obviously with surveys of their undergraduates, they report that something like 2/3 of students report what they call having overwhelming anxiety. Or, another example there, about 40%, 39%, report that they are so depressed they're unable to function as students in a certain portion of their career between 18 and 21, so a bit older than the teenager. And the last number to mention, and it was already hinted at in what you said, if we go to the American Association of Pediatrics, they're reporting that the number of cases admitted to hospital for either suicide attempt or self-harm has now doubled in the last 10 years. And the doubles as a result of primarily these conditions. So we have obviously, in terms of the nation, one could even say beyond the nation, I think this is actually international, not specific to the United States, we have a picture these days that's quite radically different from what it was even a decade or 15 years ago. I mentioned one more little statistic because it comes not from your country but from my country. You can guess where that is. With reference to loneliness, I couldn't quite believe it until I actually read it, that there is now in Britain a minister of loneliness. Did you see that? They've actually created a new ministry, a ministry of loneliness. There's a single person, I'm assuming a single person, who's the minister of loneliness. because despite that it would cost the taxpayer money, the British government has recognized the condition of loneliness is so extreme and economically so devastating that it merits tax money to create a government agency to try and address this condition, specifically then in younger people.
In Japan too.
I heard that also, yes. Japan has also done that, even earlier, I think, than the British. Yeah. So we haven't got that yet in the United States, but we may give it a different name so we don't laugh at it. But nonetheless, this may be coming our way as well. So we have a condition statistically that is worth looking at, and that's in a way what I'd like to do this evening. One little other item of statistics before we move on. There was one study which looked at these growing numbers, specifically of these, and these, and noticed that the surge of increase of anxiety, depression, stress, the surge came around 2011. And that's a very interesting year, because in that academic year, 2010-11, in that academic year, that was the year in which the iPhone went over 50% of the population. That is, more than half of the people acquired this instrument. Not to say there's a causal relationship there, but an interesting statistical one between the onset of a new way of being in the world, more precisely socially or not socially, with other beings, and these conditions having to do with the health of the soul. Now, I want to go back to these conditions here to say a word more about them, if I may. And the first is to look at how in Waldorf education we look at these conditions through the lens of a healthy human being. You may know that in many ways, there are all many ways to look at the human being, but one way is to recognize that if you take in the full human, one can identify 3 different systems, and they all relate to these conditions. The first we know is the nervous system, and all the senses that go with that, focused obviously in the upper range around the head, brain, and the senses that are close to them, although of course they extend right down to the fingertips in touch. Second system we have is more or less what you might call the middle bit, having to do with respiration and circulation, and you know that circulation and respiration work very closely together. So they are 2 systems, but they are like twins, you might say. Fraternal, not identical, but nonetheless twins. And then there's a third system, sometimes frankly overlooked, especially in regard to this subject here, and that is the whole realm of metabolism, sexuality, and basically you might say willpower expressed through our capacity to act in our limbs. And these 3 systems, the one having to do with the nervous and sense system, the second with respiration and circulation, and the third having to do with metabolism and the activity that can arise through our limbs, these systems have to work together. I say that because if you take the nervous system and the metabolism, they have a very special relationship. More precisely, as you may know, if you accentuate one, you significantly inhibit the other. I won't do this to you now, but if I were to make a sudden and surprising loud noise, momentarily your nervous system would be jolted into activity, reception, but at the same time your metabolism, more precisely your intestine and the stomach that goes with it, would contract. If there were too much contraction, embarrassment. But you get the idea. And these 2 work in a certain antiphonal way. The more you have of this, the less you have to have of that. And the reverse. Think Thanksgiving dinner. Big meal. And now you've got to work on this big meal. Metabolism is now in overdrive. No vacation for the metabolism at Thanksgiving. And what happens to the nervous system? Well, maybe a nap, but at most watching football. That's as far as it can go. And these 2 work in a certain complementary opposition. So now, if we think this through, if we recognize that we are living at a time of children increasingly alert in their nervous system, and these are extreme examples of that, you can appreciate what's happening then with their metabolism. That is possibly the other side of this issue of anxiety, because it has consequences. And the consequences are that if your metabolism is inhibited, quite apart from the stress and the anxiety and depression that may come from overstimulated nervous system, there are other problems that happen as well. We now begin to see those problems. You may know that There is now, maybe not in this school because we're working in other ways, but in many walks of child's life, we begin to see more and more cases of child obesity. That is to say, the inability to digest food. That's not because the metabolism is inadequate, it's rather because they're not enough in movement. And if you're not in movement, the metabolism won't do its job. It's also exacerbated if you eat things that are easily metabolized, but that's different. The point here is that if you have an overly nervous activity and inhibited metabolism, you don't burn it off. And if you don't burn it, you store it. Now, children are resilient, and they will put up with this up to a point. But it is, I think, of some concern now that we begin to see the consequences of obesity in children that is normally the case in adult or even old age life. We begin, as you may know, now to see in children the kinds of diseases that are normally restricted to the second half of life, for example, the second type of diabetes, which can be controlled through diet and movement, exercise, but usually comes later, and if it comes later can be contained, it cannot be cured. It can only be controlled. So the question is open, what happens when young children begin to have the conditions of adult and old age, a condition that can at best be contained. So that brings me then to the next point I want to raise this evening, and that has to do with the fact that if we look at education, we begin to see some other indications of this problem. I want to take three, because I think in early childhood and in the lower school and by extension in the high school, we begin to see the consequences of this overstimulated nervous system and correspondingly crippled, I will call it, certainly inhibited, frozen you might say, paralyzed ability to move. How do we see this now in early childhood? We had an interesting conversation earlier today in this room about how children learn. And if you are familiar to these kinds of talks, you know that typically we say in Waldorf schools that in the preschool years, children learn in all kinds of ways, but the way that's most effective is that they learn simply by doing things, more precisely, by imitating things worthy of being done. Don't waste your breath telling a young kid what to do. Just do it and let them imitate what you do. A much more effective, lasting lesson that is. So, learning simply by doing in an imitative way. Lower school, imitation may continue, but now something else takes over. It's kind of imitation gone inside, you might say. They're not imitating you necessarily through their behavior, but inwardly they begin to imitate not you, but the ideals they have, or the heroes they have, or something bigger than themselves that they want to, in my language, they want not to imitate, but to emulate. And this is also a way of learning in the lower school with the whole world of imagination and stories and fantasies and fairy tales. And these are all vehicles for engaging this capacity inwardly to imitate something that's bigger and possibly better than you are. And then we come to the high school. Does a high school kid learn by imitating? Well, only if they are mimicking and making fun of you. That's about as far as it goes. And are they emulating? Well, yes, but often they're emulating things that you would rather they not. But they do learn well and effectively by another style, which is not imitative, not emulative. It has to do with something else. It has to do with taking in the world and, in a certain sense, working not out of their sense impressions and not even out of their respiration and circulation, but working out of their metabolism in a psychological way. And if a teenager takes the world in the way we take in food, then the only way the child of that age can learn is by destroying what it takes in. We talk about the teenager making it his or her own. That's exactly right. They take impressions, but if they simply swallow them, watch out. Yes, it's rather embarrassing and inconvenient for them to argue with you all the time at the dinner table and to do the opposite of what you want, but rejoice in their rebellion, because they are taking in the world and they are destroying it in order to make something of it themselves. And that's exactly what happens when you metabolize food. As my mentor was fond of saying, you are not, here's the good news for the evening, you are not what you eat. You are not what you eat. You are what you have destroyed in what you've eaten. That's who you are. And the proof of that is any single cell you extract from your tongue or your skin or any part of your body and check out to see if any residuum of your meal is there. And I guarantee, if you're healthy, I guarantee there is no trace at all. There's only your stamp, your DNA, your genetics, your nucleus on every single cell that you create, which is who your body is or becomes. So the good news is you are not what you eat, you are what you have made of what you've eaten. But that's a kind of analogy for the way in which the teenager learns. Take the world in, nuke it, so to speak, annihilate it in order to create out of that destruction yourself. That's how the teenager learns. So now in the conversation we had this afternoon with the faculty, I was asking questions and the responses that the faculty gave are consonant with what I'm hearing from other schools, Waldorf as well as non-Waldorf. And that is there's a new phenomenon happening in the early childhood. Some, but not all, but some, a growing number of very young children, we are told, have difficulty imitating. And one might ask why that is, and there are interesting hypotheses to suggest why that is. But if you think for a second about the frozen will, or the frozen ability to move, or the frozen ability to metabolize and do, then you perhaps can appreciate why these young children have difficulty imitating. By the same token, in the lower school, we again talked about it this afternoon, the class teachers now begin to report, somewhat puzzled sometimes, that children are having a difficult time creating mental pictures. All kinds of hypothetical reasons why they're not doing it. But again, that has to do with a certain freezing of one's own volition, not at the level of the body now, but more in the level of the feeling life, the level of the soul. And it might have something to do with the fact that they received so many pre-digested or pre-created pictures that it becomes increasingly difficult to create your own. Or at a minimum, if your nervous system is on overdrive and your metabolism and your capacity to do things, the will is in a certain sense inhibited. That's another way of describing this, because you need your inner will to create mental pictures. And then what about the high school? This is more subtle, I think, but I think from high school teachers I begin to hear this, and certainly it's my own experience working with teenagers still as a guest teacher. And that is that if you think about the task of the teenager to learn by creating out of him or herself, then you can appreciate in order to create something yourself, you have to be able to weigh, to judge, to discern, to say, is this right, is this wrong, does this make sense to me? Not that you tell me it's so, but does it make sense because I can resonate with that? That's a kind of assessing, weighing, judging, and that's the way the teenager is learning. So now I begin to see, and also hear from my colleagues, that we have a rising generation of teenagers increasingly unable to arrive at judgments. Either they say everything goes, or nothing is worth it, which is the absence of judgment, either accepting everything of roughly equal relevance, or rejecting everything, because you can't judge or discern or select something over something else. And these three conditions then, the kind of inhibition of imitation in the early years, this inhibition of mental picturing in the grade school, and then this tentativeness, this reluctance or possibly inability to arrive at judgment in the high school. These are all fairly modern conditions which have a lot to do with these conditions here. I mention all that here because at least in terms of what my understanding of education is, these three inhibitions are attacking precisely the most important channels through which the young child, the grade school child, the high school kid learn. So with that as possibly as melancholic a picture as I can paint for you, I want to move now to a somewhat different perspective here to see, well, if this is resonating with you or with our times, then the question is, what is it that we should be doing about that? Or more precisely, how is it that we can be helpful? In turning to this second part, I want to offer a couple of thoughts here. The first is that in this picture of the nervous system and metabolism in some kind of, sometimes competition, but at least some kind of comparative opposition, between those two, they both ultimately lead to exhaustion. You can see that. But there is something in us that never wears out, that never tires. Breathing is one, and the heart circulation is the other. It doesn't matter how well or sick you are. It may be faster, maybe slower, but it still is. And notice that with every pulse you take, every breath you take, each one is slightly different. You don't have a heartbeat. That's actually an incorrect use of language. There's only one time in your life when you approach a heartbeat. Do you know what that is? When you're about to die. Shortly before you die, the heart, which has had this kind of regulatory style, more this, more that, always adjusting to your circumstances, it's almost as if the heart goes into a kind of automatic pulse, but not a pulse now, but a beat, where every pulse is of equal weight. That's what a beat is as opposed to a pulse. And that is the signal that you're about to pass away. So the heart does not beat, but it pulses. And I make that point because in the pulse is always recalibrating, readjusting to the two other systems, the nervous system and metabolism. You're too warm, it speeds up. You're too cold, it also speeds up. Depending on your circumstances, it will speed or slow so that you retain a certain kind of ongoing health. So for me, therefore, if we're trying to recalibrate the imbalance between our nervous system and our metabolism, one way to do that is to look to the middle. That is to say, to look to respiration and look to circulation. How can we strengthen those systems so that they help to readjust the imbalances that our society, or possibly our own behaviors, impose on us up here or down below? With that question in mind, I'd like to go now back to these 6 conditions. That is to say, anxiety, depression, stress, loneliness, fanaticism, and fragmentation, with these kind of in the wings there, to see is there anything we can do to help these 6 conditions by working on the middle. That is to say, working on the breath, working on the circulation. Let's start with anxiety. This afternoon I asked the high school teachers, or the teachers or the faculty, to follow me in this exercise, and maybe you still are willing to do it as well. If you've done it once, you don't have to do it again. But nonetheless, if you're here now, take in a breath and hold it. Don't let it out. Instead, take another one, and a third one, and maybe a fourth one. Okay. One more time. Now this time, if you're not a teacher, you've done this before, but this time, just look about you to see what's happening to people as they go through this exercise. Ready? Here we go. 1, here we go. 1. Second one. They did that earlier. Third one. Last one. There you go. What do you see? What do you observe? Teachers, you can't play because you played earlier. Others, what do you, pardon me?
Being taller.
Being taller, yes. Making more room as we have to, right? What else did you observe?
Blood flows, they're getting red.
Where?
In the face.
In the face. Maybe here also, but mostly here. The blood goes upstairs. All right? What else did you observe? Eyebrows. Yeah. What about posture? Straight?
Expand.
Yes? Just straight or something else? I saw something else. Yeah. I saw a lot of this. I wasn't expecting that until it happened this afternoon. So you've done the same thing that the teachers did. And that's very interesting, because as you breathe and breathe and breathe without letting go, then what's happening is you're, in a certain sense, creating more space between you and everybody else. That's loneliness. When more and more space is perceived between you and the rest of the world, to the point where there is almost infinite horizon between you and the next island where the next lonely person is trapped. So this condition of breathing in and breathing in and breathing in without breathing out is a kind of physiological expression of this condition of anxiety, which in its extreme physiological case is known as asthma. Now, wouldn't you know it, that when Rudolf Steiner spoke to the first group of teachers, almost 100 years ago now, we'll celebrate that next year, in Stuttgart, he said to the teachers on the first day of the teacher training, he says you have two jobs here. Your first job is to help the children breathe. That was 100 years ago. And the second thing, which seemed equally strange, because don't kids breathe without being trained? The second thing he said was, we have to help the children sleep. Well, that's good news for teachers. Seems to happen quite easily. Well, not exactly. Not the kind of sleep we want. But go back to the first one. Help the children to breathe. I think already then Rotostano recognized that we were heading into a time where more and more children would not be able to breathe equally. They would breathe in, but they wouldn't breathe out enough. Or if they breathed out, it would be breathing out too much and not taking enough in. That's the condition of depression. So these two, either breathing in too much and holding it, or exhaling too much and not taking in enough, these are two modern conditions, which I think he then foresaw. So the question is, how can we help students breathe? Well, we can start physiologically. I have one colleague of mine who's a language teacher. He starts every lesson, I'm not saying you do this, but just as an example, he starts every lesson with the children, students, high school students, sitting, waiting. And then he says, and the kids know to expect this, he does it at every lesson, he says, "Silenzio!" And then they know that the next 60 seconds are theirs. They can just breathe. They can let go of the previous lesson. They can just be quiet. They can do nothing. They can put their head down for a minute. 60 seconds. When you go through that lesson, it seems such a long time. It's only a minute. 1/45 of a lesson. And yet, what a payback. Usually because they breathe in too much, they can now literally breathe out. So physiologically, I think, as teachers, by extension as parents, I would say, if we can imagine ways in which we can help our kids breathe out, that's already a beginning. But there's obviously more to it than simply working at the physical level. We can also speak about psychological breathing out. And what does that look like? What does it mean when you breathe out psychologically? Well, it was very interesting. There was a survey done in Newsweek, when Newsweek existed. A reporter went out from the magazine with an agenda, I have to say, and she interviewed a bunch of teenagers. The question she asked was, what do you really want most? She had certain expectations of what would come back. But what actually came back was very different from what she expected. What she got was this. Where is it? Here. No. Where is it? Somewhere one of you said, lack of attention. What she got back was teenagers saying, we want to spend more time with our parents, with them listening to us. That little phrase was important at the end there. Not just the company, but listening to them. That's an example of psychological breathing out. Now, especially if you have boys, they're not going to do it of themselves. You say, how was your school day? Fine. Did you learn something? Nope. So just recognize the fact that monosyllables is the vocabulary of the 9th and 10th grader, if he or she is masculine usually. Girls might do something quite different. They might give you a whole disposition on how the day went, depending who they are. But still, the point here is that whether encouraged or simply allowed the opportunity for them simply to say a bit about their day, with you doing nothing more, but nothing less than listening, that already is a psychological, I would say, breathing out. And then I would say there's a third kind of breathing out, and this is very different. It has to do then with not so much the physiological, although that plays into it, not even just the psychological, it also plays a role. This is a more kind of spiritual breathing out. What does it mean to breathe out spiritually? Well, you may know that in some schools, I can't speak for this one, but some Waldorf schools, they pay particular attention, especially in high school now, to the, let's call it the art of speech. The art of speech. Can be dramatic speech, or just simply recitation, or disquisition, or a senior project, or different ways of public speaking perhaps. The art of speech. Now, what is specific about speech is, notice you can't speak on the in-breath. Doesn't work. The only way you can speak is on the out-breath. As Christy Barnes, who may be known to many of you, she lived in the fellowship as an old Waldorf teacher before she died here. Christy Barnes, who was a speech artist herself, you may know, she said, speech is always for the other. That is, when you speak, you are giving something of yourself to the world or the audience or your beloved or your partner or whoever it is that's ready to receive what you have to speak. And that donation, that giving, is, to my mind, a certain kind of spiritual breathing out. And if we're talking about anxiety as the inhalation, the over-inhalation of breath, physiological but also psychological and spiritual, then you can perhaps begin to appreciate how these very simple exercises, be they bodily or psychological or spiritual, can help with that. I'm not saying they will cure the condition. I'm saying they will either help to prevent it or they may begin to release the consequences of it. So anxiety and the question of breathing. Let's go now for a second to this one here, the question of depression. What is the problem with depression? Well, there are many problems because depression is very different from person to person. And yet there may be some shared gestures that go with the state of depression, having to do then with weight, burden, inability to move. So this is not now movement staunch because you are frozen in paralysis for your muscles. This is a staunching of movement because you can't move at all. So, what is the solution to not moving at all? The worst thing you can do is cheer them up. It's not so bad. You think you've got problems? No. That will, if anything, accelerate the depression. So what can one do? What do people who are depressed learn to do? Yes. What kind of movement?
Walk.
That's one. Another one?
Yoga.
Yoga? Another one?
Eurythmy.
Eurythmy, you bet. By the way, eurythmy applies to all 6 and everything else, but especially depression and these other 2 as well. So we have those 3. What else? What other kinds of movement? Yes.
Swimming.
Yes.
Singing?
Possibly, depending how you do it. Pardon me? Well, running and swimming, we'll take that, yeah, okay. Mm-hmm. And a certain kind of physical work. A certain kind of physical work. And depending on the kind of work you have in mind, these 7 or 8 examples have one thing in common. And the thing they have in common is rhythm. It's movement, but it's regular rhythmic movement. It's a patterned movement. And that can translate from physical examples, which are very good that you raised there, to psychological rhythms or psychological patterns, regimes, traditions, celebrations, weekly or monthly things you do. And I would even go a step further to lift that up to a spiritual level and ask what kinds of rhythmic examples could we come at this 3rd level as well. Mm-hmm. What do you do just before you go to sleep? How do you wake up, and what do you do when you first wake up? Anything that is of a rhythmic, regular, repetitive, above all, repetitive nature, won't cure depression, but it begins to move the depression. And the problem with depression, if it's a problem, as opposed to being managed, if it's a problem, is that it inhibits movement, especially then in teenagers. I hate to say it, but even homework can be helpful in this regard, if you do it, of course. If you don't do it, it adds to the burden. But if you actually do regularly, and if you can't do 10 pages, 1 page. But it's regular, every night 1 page. This already can begin to move this condition. So with regard to depression, it has to do with this repetitive nature. And notice that's what the middle system does. The heart and the lung, that's what they do. They move repetitively, rhythmically, regularly. No matter what else is going on, those things happen. So in that sense, the middle is able to help not only with the condition of anxiety, but also with depression. Now my favorite, let's look at stress for a moment. Just about every teenager I talk to says she or he is stressed. In fact, they're stressed out. I'm not quite sure what they mean by it, but they seem to feel it. So what is stress? And what's out about it? Well, let's start with stress. Coming here yesterday, I was really impressed by this new bridge you're throwing across the Hudson River. That's going to be quite a span when you're done with it. How many dozens of lanes will you have going across from here to up in Westchester? Not enough. Yeah, that's right. You can always take more. Just check out the Bay Bridge in San Francisco. Amazing number of lanes they have. It's still not enough either. So yes, amazing construction halfway done. Think of the stress of that bridge in a positive sense now, in the sense that you have 2 or more anchors that support these wires and other things that in magical ways hold up thousands of pounds of moving traffic and people in the cars and other things. Incredible stress. But it works, you see, because those stresses are equal. There is as much stress on the Nyack side as there is on the Westchester side, or whatever you call that over there, Tarrytown. That works. But notice what would happen if one of the anchors was weakened by somewhere. Then you got the problem. In other words, the problem with stress is not the stress. The problem with the stress is it is unequal. So what's an example of unequal stress? Well, here's one. Typical, and this is teenagers, and I think adults may also recognize the condition. You go through your day, and your day is inevitably filled with all these pressures and tensions that we've talked about. You get, as we say, wound up. And now you lie in bed all wound up. And you relive your day, and in reliving your day, you get more and more wound up because your day was winding you in the first place. So now there you are, sleepless in Spring Valley, all night long. So what do you need to do? You know what to do. Sheep. That is, backwards sheep. If that doesn't work, I have some other tricks which my wife taught me. She's a math teacher. She had all kinds of little involving the number 100. I won't go into that now. But nonetheless, if you have this problem, then you look for ways of unstressing by this. And wouldn't you know it, again 100 years ago, Rudolf Steiner offered a very simple exercise known to many of you called the retrospect, the Rückschau. But the important part of the Rückschau, 2 aspects of it. One is that if you review your day, you do it in reverse order. Not going forwards, that will continue to wind you up even further, especially if the day was irritating. No, in reverse order. That's the one aspect. And the other aspect is that you don't run the video backwards. That is, you don't rerun the tape of your memory. What you do is you step outside yourself and observe yourself going backwards through your day. So now you stand on the landing of your house, if you have a landing and 2 floors, and you watch yourself going backwards out of bed downstairs in order to turn off the coffee machine, whatever you turn off before you go to bed. And you observe yourself going backwards through your day, not by being in it, see the difference? Not like the Psycho Hitchcock film, which films things backwards going downstairs, but rather observing somebody else going downstairs backwards through his or her day, quickly. This retrospect. Most folks report when they do it, they fall asleep, because you are literally uncoiling that tension, that stress. That's the physiological, even quasi-psychological example. But now we can go further, because there are all kinds of other things you can do backwards, precisely to reduce or to release, better said, not reduce, release this kind of pressure, this kind of stress. The study recommends if you are prone to this stress, then another thing you can try to do, and I think even children can be encouraged to do this, is to learn something backwards. For example, if you're musically inclined, let me go over here, if the camera can follow me, I'll go over here. And if you don't recognize that tune, here it is, one more time.
Happy birthday. That'll reduce stress. In case you're wondering, I took years to learn that. This is not easy, but you can do it with poetry, other recitations. You can also even run an argument backwards. These are all examples of lifting this exercise of the retrospect to the more psychological, less bodily or experiential level. And these are all ways, I would say, of trying to get at this issue of stress with children or with... so I wouldn't recommend this particular exercise for young children, but even if they tell you a bit about their day in reverse order, what happened before this and then before that and before that, that can also be a little indication of releasing what might otherwise be this wound-upness at the end of a tense day. So, stress. Now let's look at the next one here, having to do with loneliness. This is interesting for me because there is now a growing body of research in the economic sphere. It's coming out of the advertising industry. And they're recognizing that with this barrage of advertising that comes with all manner of ways, and I don't need to name them for you, you know what I'm talking about. The problem is that the more advertising there is, the less effective it is. Because more and more screens and voices and other things and telephone calls are trying to grab the same thing, and you have only a limited amount of it. And what is the it? The it is attention. So now there's a whole industry, a whole research developing on what is called attention industry. From the economic point of view, it's been recognized that attention is the most valuable, I hate to say it, but that's what they say, it is the most valuable commodity. And now companies are trying to figure out how to get your attention. Well, how do they get attention? They get attention because you give it. Notice you can't rent attention, you can't lease it, you can only donate it. When it comes to the treatment of loneliness, this is in a certain sense what loneliness needs. It needs attention. Now it works both ways. On the one hand, the person who is lonely is longing for attention. If they don't feel lonely, they won't have that need. But it goes the other way as well. Because if they're not attentive, that is to the world, they are only attending to themselves. And therefore feeling all the more their solipsistic loneliness. So the trick goes both ways. On the one hand, to donate attention, and it is a gift to donate attention. On the other hand, to try and induce the attention to shift from self to the world. Now the first one has been researched in a very interesting way, and it has to do with something as simple as, oh, I don't have one. May I borrow that for a second? As simple as one of these.
Did you see this piece of research? There was research done in which two people were placed at a table, and their conversation was monitored, that is, it was videoed and recorded and analyzed. Then a cell phone was introduced and placed between them, turned off and turned upside down. And then the conversation was videoed and recorded and analyzed. And the conversation changed. How did it change? It became a bit more fragmented. It became a little bit more surface. It became a little bit less humanly engaged. And the sentences were shorter. And it was turned off. It didn't ring. It just was there. In other words, we now begin to show with empirical evidence that this particular machine is an attention grabber, whether we like it or not. And just its presence in the room, more precisely in a table between people, is enough to suck, as it were, magnetically to attract your attention. Or at least your half attention, because half of you is talking, other half is hoping for some little stimulus. Thank you. So, now with adults and their children. I hate to say it, but how often do we see it? How often do we ourselves go for a walk with our kids, engage with our children, with the cell phone here, or possibly buzzing in the pocket? It's present, whether it's visible or not, it's physically present. And the children know this. Remember, children are unconsciously clairvoyant. They know where your attention is, whether you are looking at them or not. They know exactly where your attention is, where your consciousness is. And if there is a device between them and you, they know that. Not consciously, they know that. So we have an issue. And as adults, because we can be conscious of these things, the kids are not, as adults we are conscious that we have something now that either will get in the way of attention, and that will make loneliness the more potent, or something that we can deliberately set aside, and out of that deliberate act be able to work on this issue of loneliness by literally donating, by paying attention. That's a simple example, but you get the idea. That in working with this issue of loneliness, it is something as simple as human attending that addresses it. And then both of you can be lonely together, but at least you are, in some sense, engaged. To finish then finally with the last two. This is maybe a bit more obscure, but with reference to the question of fanaticism. Is there a cure for fanaticism? No. Is there a way of preventing it, or at least working it and moving it? I think so. I say that because in an exercise that Steiner offered in a different context, he suggested that there's a little mental thing one can do that will work with these issues of anxiety and the rest, but also I think has impact on this reaction to anxiety, which I call fanaticism. Entertain an idea. Oh, let's have one. We need a good one, though. Let's have a good example. Here, how about this one? This should go down well with you. Textbooks are the best way of learning. You with me? I hope not. Textbooks are the best way of learning. Well, you may have a certain opinion about that, and I'm going to assume it's maybe shared by your neighbors. But for the moment, imagine entertaining that thought without deciding whether that's correct or not, just as a hypothesis. In other words, you take up a thought, preferably a thought you really dislike or have a very firm opinion about. You take up a thought and you simply suspend it without either grabbing it in agreement or dismissing it out of hand. You simply have it in the air as a hypothesis. And then you leave it. You come back the next day and you do it again. It takes a bit more patience because you really want to have that opinion. But you let it hang. Maybe 3 times. And then let it go altogether. Teenagers have a very hard time with this. So you have to start modestly. Take something they're not too offended or too committed to. Some kind of hypothesis. Or a variation on the theme. This I get from Niels Bohr, who made the observation that the opposite of a correct statement is an incorrect statement. And the opposite of a profound statement is another profound statement. And if therefore you can enter into this suspension of judgment on a statement, it may actually suggest something you never thought of before. Or, variation again, there are certain statements you can try out and simply stick with it. For example, let's try this. You take an idea, let's try, let's say the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. A familiar phrase in Waldorf schools. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Now stick with that idea long enough until you arrive at the conviction that the whole is precisely the sum of its parts. 2 plus 2. So now what you've done, you've taken an idea and you stayed with it and waited for it to flip into its opposite. That's another way of addressing this question of the over-swift grabbing onto a concept with conviction. You suspend the conviction as an exercise, not that you have to believe this, it's an exercise. You suspend the judgment as an exercise in order to allow this fanatical reflex to have some kind of release. That is also a way of working with these conditions of loneliness and other 5 forms of anxiety or fear, as somebody put it. Does that make any sense? There are other examples you might have also that would be helpful to try out. But this is all a way of trying to work to release a kind of grip. This is the same grip that's the sympathetic reflex for the anxiety, but the grip is now psychological, even cognitive. You're trying to release that grip in order to have a different kind of attitude about what you're thinking. Yes?
Do you mean essentially doing the opposite of arguing with the fanaticism?
Yes, absolutely. And those 2 things go together. The one is the listening, because often these go together. The one is the listening, and then the second is the entertainment of something that you know to be nonsense.
Whether you say it or they say it.
Right, yeah. But I have to say, most teenagers self-correct. If they say something stupid long enough, it kind of fixes itself, you know. They outgrow it. As my history teacher was fond of saying, we have never solved historical problems. We've never solved historical strife. We just outgrow them. At the time, I remember being very depressed by that thought, because out of a certain idealism, I wanted to see it resolved. But in retrospect, I can recognize, at least in terms of the historical books that we have, we do outgrow our fanatical ideas. We don't actually solve them. And the more you argue them, of course, the more fervent they become, because they're not logical. That leaves one more, this one here. And this one I would reserve really for high school. I don't think this is something that the lower school child feels so much. It comes later, at least to cognition, to consciousness, it comes later, typically in high school, where nothing has any relationship to anything else. However, if you've gone, especially in a Waldorf school, there may happen something in the 12th grade which is very interesting. This happens to me all the time. So, let's say I'm teaching a course in genetics. Main lesson in genetics. Main lesson is finished. The kids, students, seniors especially, go off to yes, eurythmy. And then one of the seniors comes back later in the day and he says, or she says, have you been talking to the eurythmist? Because what you described in genetics this morning is exactly what we did in eurythmy 2 hours later. Okay. Now, inwardly, I can rejoice. Outwardly, I say, no, I didn't talk to her or him. And I didn't, it's true. But what do I know? I know that within the genius of the curriculum are embedded themes that are shared. And there's a reason why we teach genetics in the 12th grade and not in the 9th grade. And there are reasons why you have certain exercises in 12th grade eurythmy you would not do in 8th grade or 9th grade. There's a reason for all that. And to the degree that a teenager begins to discover those hidden connections, those hidden relationships, it is a healing of the sense of fragmentation. Because now, in the seeming disconnected curriculum and schedule of a main lesson for this science and a track for that arts, a thread, a relationship, a fabric begins to emerge. And notice, it's not a fabric that we dictate to them. It's a fabric they uncover. It's a fabric they discover. I have to say, they even stitch themselves. And that kind of discovery, finding hidden connections, I would say, goes well beyond the Waldorf curriculum. For example, if you can begin to see hidden connections between seemingly unconnected phenomena on Main Street, the same thing is at work. For instance, something as simple as this. If you walk down any main street in a town and you walk past certain buildings, I bet you can identify their function without looking at the sign that names them. For example, can you picture the bank? Okay, different architecture, but typically bank, often pillars, frieze, having no relationship to the carrying weight, of course. These are pure fascia, they're pure extras. And yet there's something about these pillars and this pyramid and this frieze that makes us reassured about banks. Having nothing to do with finance and economic theory, having to do with religion and belief in the gods. So you can begin to read these fronts of stores and fronts of buildings and begin to discover their hidden connection. What is it that the building is saying? Why do banks waste their money on pillars that don't support the roof? There's a reason for that. And they have figured out very well it's worth the money to invest in this facade. So they know, but then they conceal it. But if you begin to uncover these connections or these reasons for doing things, this is again a way of showing a kind of underlying pattern, underlying coherence that is actually helpful. Yes?
What about people who see connections when there really aren't any? I mean, that's also kind of a mental illness.
Yes.
Too many connections.
Such as?
Like, for example, if you have a TV show that's talking about a person with credit problems, and you just spoke with a friend about your credit problems that you had yesterday, and all of a sudden you're like, oh my goodness, the whole world knows I have credit problems. That can be a sign of significant mental illness.
Correct.
That happens to you all the time.
That's correct.
Is that just something good gone really bad, or how does that work?
I'm glad you mentioned that, because all the things I'm saying tonight have embedded in them a certain human element of freedom. That is, you can do it or not. And the moment you engage anything that involves human freedom, the possibility of error has to be there. If it's not free. So therefore, if you are finding connections, you're quite right, you might make a mistake. But the interesting thing is, when you follow the connections, they usually self-correct, if you are honest. Now, if you are mentally, of course, disturbed, this is a different issue. But I'm not in a way addressing psychological pathology here. I'm addressing the situation of human beings more generally, in the sense that if you have the capacity of discerning a thread or connection, if you go far enough with a connection, it will self-correct if you are wrong. But the trick is to stay with the thought. That's again the idea of taking an idea till it flips to the opposite. The logic, the discipline, shall we say, of following a thought through to its end or its flip is what I'm talking about here. And it's that activity that addresses this sense of fragmentation. But thank you for that comment. So this brings me perhaps to the last thing I want to say this evening, because I've talked to some maybe too length about working with the middle realms, the realms of breathing, the realms of circulation, the rhythms and so forth, as ways of addressing these conditions. But I said to you earlier, if you were alert, I said there are actually two approaches to this issue of dealing with these conditions. I want to finish now briefly with a second approach, which is related to the first one, but it's not exactly the same. If you go back to the picture that Rudolf Steiner had about the way in which the human being develops, then you may know that he describes a certain phase of development up to the kindergarten years, and then a second phase in the lower school, up to puberty, and a third phase taking you through high school and frankly even the years of undergraduate university as well, each one roughly 7 or 8 years long. So that by the time you're 21, maybe 22 or 3, one can speak of a person being fully adult. We used to think that it happened much faster, that you were fully adult by 18, and you certainly can go off to war at 18 and a bunch of other things you're allowed to do at 18 that you wouldn't do when you were 12, so we figure the 18 is kind of the adult. But at least where I come from in New England, we had laws governing behavior at 18, like drinking and so forth. And then, without quite knowing why, the state legislature in Concord, New Hampshire, raised the age to 21. They couldn't quite defend it, but they figured there was something wrong about 18, that the drinking didn't quite work at 18, but 21, it might be a bit different. And at least one can say that there's one industry that understands this very well, that you are not fully adult until you've gone past 21 or 22 or so forth. And the one industry is the car insurance companies and the car rental companies. They know that at 21 or 22, they give a cushion, they make it 25 to be sure of it, but they know that until you are low 20s, you're not really fully adult. And they could never know why that is. They wouldn't talk about the captain coming aboard the ship, but they have a feeling that there's something different after you've passed your 20s. And of course, in some cultures, we even celebrate the coming out, so-called coming out at 21. So we can speak about these phases of development. Now, these phases, be they preschool, lower school, high school and college, and then finally fully adulthood, in a certain sense, they're under a certain kind of guidance, shall we say. The guidance of the individuality, the guidance of the I. And at least the way we describe it in Waldorf education, we say that this I, this kernel, this pillar, as it were, at the center of our being, doesn't fully take hold until the early 20s. We now begin to have empirical evidence that supports that idea, by the way, with the development of the neocortex of the brain. Nonetheless, we have this notion of this progressive development. All that I've described to you this evening is the kind of activity that would require a fully arrived I. And from that point of view, everything I've said is a waste of your time with a teenager if they're not fully yet inhabited by an I. But the good news is that the performance is always preceded by the rehearsal. In other words, you practice something long before you actually present it. And the same is true here, that what is happening when you're in your 20s and fully adult is already being practiced long before, and certainly in the high school years. So what I have said may have some relevance, because even if you're not fully capable of the particular exercises I offered you, you can at least practice them. And that's a variation then of the theme. Can we practice this sense of I-hood, this I-ness, before it really arrives? And if we do that, can we help also from a different way, a different perspective, these conditions that I've mentioned here, and frankly even there? And I would suggest to you, we can. But how? How can we use this sense of developing of the I to address the issues, for example, of anxiety? If you think about, now I'll just give one example here. If you think about anxiety, for the most part, maybe not entirely, but for the most part, usually anxiety is about the future. It's about what hasn't happened yet. In other words, if you step into a state of anxiety, you're really stepping out of the moment into a not yet there moment. And therefore, the more that you can cultivate a sense of being in the moment, you address already this capture, this being trapped in the future. And there are all kinds of ways in which, especially the teenager, you can assist the teenager in being in the moment. If I were to go to the 9th grade curriculum, for example, it's all about that. That's what we do in the 9th grade. Just about every main lesson is in service of being in the moment, more precisely through an approach to the education that is phenomenological, based on observations, not upon theorizing, not upon remembering, that's the past, theorizing is the future. No, it's based on observation, what you actually see. It's what you might call the Sam Spade approach to education. Just what do you see in the moment without trying to explain it. That's a beginning in the 9th grade of trying to develop a consciousness that begins not in memory, past, not in fantasy or speculation, future, but begins without judging, without explaining, in description. That's one example of making the teenager in the moment present. Thank you. And there are more examples like that, but I want to keep it brief for now. This question of depression. I mentioned already before that a lot of depression, not all of it, but a lot of depression is, can I say, burdened by what was, what happened, what I didn't do, what she or he did to me, all to do with what happened. This is the opposite situation, trapped not in the future now, but preoccupied with the past. And again, bringing attention to the present is intended to be a remediation of this condition. Stress, same idea. Remember, stress is not the bridge, that's good stress. Stress is the weak, one-sided of the stress. So again, the attempt to work with that involves the capacity to hold equal and opposite forces in some kind of equipoise. How many of you have seen this extraordinary film called Man on Wire? Man on Wire. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go check that out as a metaphor for the teenager becoming a fully integrated human being who's able to balance equal and opposite forces. And just to give you a preview of coming attractions, this madcap Frenchman, Philippe Petit, who on the morning, at 6:30 in the morning, with the fog still rising for what was still in those days the Twin Towers in Manhattan, he threw a wire between the two towers and then was filmed, because he had a film crew with him, was filmed stepping out onto the wire. And he looked kind of scared, because all he had was his little, actually a very large 50-foot pole. And then he went with the other foot, and he still looked pretty scared. But then a very interesting thing happened to him. He stepped out onto the wire between the two towers, 1,000 feet above ground, and his face changed. And he acquired, I'm not making this up, he acquired a certain kind of serenity and uprightness and calm and centeredness. A smile appeared on his face, and he simply walked between the two towers across this wire. At the far end was a policeman waiting to arrest him. And he approached the policeman and turned around. Came back. Tried again. This time a bit more positive from the beginning, because he'd done it now successfully once. Stepped out, laid down on the wire, on his back. Stood up, carried on. The policeman's still waiting for him, so he went back then. Third time he went across, this time he knelt. With one knee, he knelt on the wire, stood up. Finally, eventually, continued and was embraced by the policeman and was arrested at the other end. Was tried, but he was forgiven because of the nature of the game, and he was, in exchange for doing a street show for the kids, he was allowed to escape the prison sentence that was put upon him. But it's a wonderful image of a being utterly integral, utterly upstanding, utterly centered, able to embrace, in this case stress, equal opposite forces, and through the equal oppositeness and the uprightness to move from one place to the next. That's a way of maybe metaphorically speaking about the relationship of the I in relationship to the feelings of stress. And to finish out now finally with the last ones here, and then we're done. Here, loneliness. It's very interesting. What happens to the lonely person when the I comes fully aboard? I'll put it simply. Loneliness changes from loneliness to solitude. And solitude you can live with, because solitude you can share. Loneliness, by definition, you can't share, but solitude you can. I'll leave open the question how you move from a feeling of loneliness, which feels separation, to a sense of solitude, which still feels a separation. But the difference is, in solitude, you feel the identity. You feel the coherence. You feel the fact that you can survive. You have the feeling that I can make it, even though I am alone. Not lonely now, but just alone. And that moves the condition out of a pathology into a strength. With regard to fanaticism, very interesting research done by an Israeli doctor called Aaron Antonovsky. You may remember the story, the research he published. He looked at survivors of the Holocaust who emigrated then from Europe to Israel after the Second World War. They arrived in Israel with obviously very similar backgrounds. But as a medical doctor, he noticed differences among basically two groups. One group, having nonetheless survived the starvation and the rest of the camps, they somehow were able to keep their health going. And with all of the handicaps and injuries to their internal organs, they were able somehow to work and survive and be healthy. And they kept jobs. And the other group, having had a similar background and a similar kind of assault upon their physical organism and their psychological being, didn't seem to be able to get moving. They kept getting ill and kept having problems and couldn't keep a job and so forth. And Antonovsky was puzzled by this because they were coming from the same population. So he did some very interesting research into their worldview, and he came up with the following observation. The first group, he said, had a worldview that was such that they could embrace everything that had happened to them in a cohesive world Weltanschauung. No matter how grim the events that had happened to them, they were able to find a place in their universe for those events. The second group couldn't do that. What had happened to them was so literally beyond the pale, so beyond their cosmos, they could not accept certain things that had happened to them. And that was the only difference that he could find between the two groups in regard to the first group's health and the second group's ongoing illness. Out of that came his whole theory of what's called resilience, the idea that if you can see things in their wholeness, this allows you to achieve a certain measure of health that is very difficult to sustain if there are things in your life which you cannot allow into your cosmos. And that one difference alone, I think, has a relationship to fanaticism, because the fanatic cannot accept certain things, frankly can't accept many things, because they often are identifying only with one. To the degree, therefore, we practice this gesture of holistic thinking, we're addressing this pathology of fanaticism. By which I mean, if you're able to develop a system of thinking in wholes, or holistic thinking, or sometimes called holographic thinking, or sometimes called morphological thinking, there's different languages for this idea, or synthetic thinking, to the degree you develop that, especially in Waldorf schools in the 12th grade, you are trying to either prevent or to heal or to release a bit this one-sided view that will not accept the whole picture. And finally then, related to that, the fragmentation is almost the same thought. If you see the world in parts, you can never be whole yourself. The only way to see the whole of the world in its health, and by the way, the word health and whole comes from the same parentage, the only way to see the world in its wholeness is if you can think in whole pictures. To the degree, therefore, that you try, as we often do in the 12th grade, especially with the subject of physics and so on, to work not just in analysis, but also in this big picture thinking, to that degree you are developing capacities, not yet the thoughts, but the capacities to see the world not in its fragments, but rather in its whole organic nature. Because if we can do that, if we can generate or if we can educate a generation of young people who are practicing the art of thinking in wholes, then they will bring not only health to themselves, but they will bring health to our society as well. Right now we are engaged in a survey of Waldorf graduates spanning the last 25 years. We're asking them a bunch of questions. And one of the questions we're asking them has to do with their ways of thinking. Not to prejudge what they think, but to try and discern how they think. And preliminary evidence is still coming in, but I can begin to see that this capacity of thinking and understanding the world in its wholeness is part of their stamp, you might say, is part of their character, is part of their genius of being graduates of a Waldorf school. So from that I take a certain amount of hope. Now, if there are further comments, I'm welcome to take them. I recognize it's getting not only late but hot, so it may be time for you to go. So my suggestion is the following. I will finish with the last verse, which I hope will gather something of what I'm trying to say here. And then if there are further comments or questions, we'll break for a couple of minutes. I'm happy to entertain them at the end. So let's finish now with this last sort of little burst of something that Rudolf Steiner offered, having to do then with how we can help our children, our students, develop this sense of the whole. More precisely, how is it that we can see in our students, even if they try to disguise their health and their wholeness, how we can see in them something that is full and rounded and integral, even if they are not yet at this moment expressing it. Here it is. It's called, you may know this, is called the new faithfulness. Create for yourself a new indomitable perception of faithfulness. What is usually called faithfulness passes so quickly. Let this be your new faithfulness. You will experience moments, fleeting moments, with the other person. The human being will appear to you then as if filled, irradiated with the archetype of the Spirit. And then there may be, indeed will be, other moments, long periods of time, when your child, your human being, your friend, is darkened. But you will learn to say to yourself at such moments, I remember the archetype. I saw it once. No illusion, no deception will rob me of that vision. Striving for that image you saw, that striving, that struggle, is the struggle for the new faithfulness. And striving for faithfulness in this new way, we will be closer to one another as if endowed with protective wings. All the best, and thank you for this evening.